effortlessly. Apparently, one cannot say the word effortlessly. Effortlessly.
Bloop boop boo. Bloop doop doo. Bloop doop da.
Hey folks, I'm Michael.
I'm Rameen.
Today we're going to chat about Sarah McLachlan's 1993 album, Fumbling Towards Ecstasy. Before I talk about my history, which I imagine is more extensive than yours, let's hear about your history with Sarah McLachlan in general. Let's start there, actually. What do you think a lot of people think about Sarah McLachlan?
Someone in the comments is going to say it if we don't, so I'm just going to say it. The dog commercial.
Yeah, the ASPCA.
The ASPCA commercial. You know the commercial where that pup is so sad because they're going to be in the arms of the angels if you do not donate. As a jumping off point from there, most people associate her with mom rock, for lack of a better word, especially of the late 90s, early 2000s era. Very light rock. The nice way of putting it would be soothing and spiritual and soulful, and the not so nice way of putting it would be twee and
sleepy.
Yeah.
I do think that there's something to that, especially if you look at her albums after this one.
Yeah.
They increasingly go that direction. But I think that Fumbling Towards Ecstasy is one of the best albums of the 90s. It's one of my favorite albums of all time, and it's also one of the first that I ever owned. For my 10th birthday in 1995, I got my own CD player, and my brother and my cousins went together and got a handful of CDs that they knew I loved, and this was one of them. I have listened to it repeatedly ever since. So this album was produced by Pierre Marchand, who produced, I believe, all of Sarah's albums, if not all, then most. She's very much in the grand tradition of gentle female singer-songwriters, but I think there's so much more behind this album that I think makes it actually really interesting.
Yeah, I had a certain impression of this album on my first listen or two, that upon closer examination, kind of peeling back the layers, I would tend to agree. Many of her gestures, shall we say, and choices are subtler than you might expect, or you might even originally notice the first time you listen.
A lot of this album is darker than it seems on first listen as well, I think. It sort of takes diving in to really get that. It's still corny at points, but that's sort of Sarah's brand, and I'm okay with it in this album.
To me, most of Sarah's music falls on a spectrum somewhere between two extremes of, like you say, dark and, dare I say, sensual, edgy. She can have a mystique to her. And then on the other end, as you say, sort of sleepier. I use the word twee, a little overly delicate, perhaps.
Yeah.
You chose sort of the perfect time of year for us to review this because something about this album feels very autumnal. Mm-hmm. On the one end, sometimes it's too pumpkin spice. But on the other hand, sometimes it is nice and, decaying leaves.
Yeah. Though I'm not a lyrics person in general, one of the things that I do like about this album is that it has some actually really complex and dark lyrics happening. Also, something that you pointed out in your notes that I've always liked about this album is she's got some real bluesy turns to her voice at points here and there that I think work really well in this context.
Yeah, overall, I like when she leans into that bluesy vibe, not only harmonically and rhythmically, but even vocally. I think the average person who maybe hasn't heard most Sarah McLachlan might use the word sirenic, or, like a siren is her voice. Mm-hmm. And even though her voice can extend there, and one of the really nice things about this album is her range and her ability to flex into different pockets of her voice, but I would actually say that, to me, the most exciting part of her voice is that when it gets that bluesy edge in her, belt into chest voice.
Yeah.
Even though she's more associated with that kind of breathier sound.
A lot of the instrumentation on this album, especially with the drums and drum machines, there are some spots on tracks that it's just drum machine or just live drums, or they're layered on top of each other in a really interesting way. The organ and synths that appear in many of the tracks, I think, work really well to fit into this sound world and have a specific effect that I'll get to in a second. She has done this before, but in this album she does a lot more of this sort of wall of sound thing with her voice, where it's soft and it's in the background, but it's like a full chord of just Sarah's breathy tone voice. singing a chord. It's always a really cool effect when she does it. And that's something that I was just telling Rameen earlier, that I actually kind of learned a lot from Sarah. From all of the first few albums that I ever owned, I picked up little bits of things that, as a composer and sometimes arranger, I do a lot. And one of those things is layering another vocal part. Let's put another vocal part on. That's something that I subliminally picked up from Sarah McLachlan. All of these things together get to what I think is the most important and interesting thing of this album, and that's the texture. The way that the percussion, the organ, and the voices work create such interesting textures, and they're not necessarily always big, grand shifts in texture, but the way that shifts in texture happen in this album, I think is just masterful. A lot of people might not know what I'm talking about when I say texture. There is a music theory video coming up in a week or two where I will be talking about that, so keep an eye out for that. Even though I was saying that there's a lot of this album that's dark and broody and eerie, I think overall the feel of this album is more like calm and soothing, even though it's got these dark pockets to it or occasional dark undertones to it.
I prefer when it does get darker, while I also think that texture is probably the coolest part of the album. I'm going to compare it to another recent album review, to The Red Shoes that we just reviewed. I think I said at the time something along the lines of, it sometimes felt like two albums spliced together. To me, this album sometimes is almost too cohesive, where the texture becomes too homogeneous for my tastes.
So there are several different versions of this album. The one that I have is not the one that we reviewed. The one that I still have a CD of in a closet in my spare bedroom. Instead of having a Joni Mitchell cover at the end, it has Possession again, but it's a solo piano and voice version of it with just Sarah accompanying herself, and it gives that song a completely different feel to it. I wanted to do the version that has the Joni cover on it because that is interesting, and I think it plays well with the rest of the album. Normally when we do these reviews, I want to jump around and focus on different things about different tracks. I couldn't find a really cohesive way to do that made sense to me for this album, so I figured we would just speed through these songs. So we'll go in order, starting with...
To me, this is one of the highlights of the album. It kicks off with a bang. It's one of the more energetic songs on the album, really. This is definitely teetering toward the more sensual and mysterious and haunting brand of Sarah. I do like that we start that way. I like that she's leaning into the sexual elements of the album early, and I like that she sounds so soulful on this track at the same time. There's more going on in this track than in some of the other tracks on the album.
I think an important thing that people who were listening to this album around the time that it came out might know that people coming to it later might not. These lyrics all come from creepy fan mail that she got. Men sending her these lyrics in letters. And she was really afraid because these are very explicit things that she said, fuck that, I'm not going to be afraid. I'm going to turn this around and make it empowering instead. It was known at the time that that was where the lyrics of this song came from. One of her creepy stalker fans in particular sued her for taking his text. But before the court case happened, he ended his own life.
Wow.
So this song has a lot of weird, dark baggage to it. I initially wanted to cover this song. My thought was, what if I just play the villain in singing this song? But then I thought about that a little bit more. It's just like, no, that's too dark. This is a song that is just for Sarah, I think. But I agree, this is one of the highlights of the album. This is the kind of song that you would occasionally see this music video playing on both MTV and VH1, more VH1, but still, like, it was on MTV a little bit sometimes too. It has enough of an edge to it that I think it can appeal to more of the rock lover than just the mom rock lover. This is one of the songs that has a drum beat and live drumming on top of it, which I think makes for an interesting texture. Speaking of texture, there's one spot where almost everything drops out, which sort of leaves the texture hanging and hollow. It's very brief, it's very subtle, but I think it does a lot for this song. And when we were talking about the little jazzy spots, when Sarah sings "And I Won't Be Denied" in the last verse, that's one of the spots that, like, that, okay, you are, like, really opening up your voice here, and you're not just being breathy with it. But that's sort of something that I want to talk about with this whole album. I would not really say that Sarah McLachlan has a great voice, but I think she uses it really effectively.
I think she has a really flexible voice, and I think that more can be attributed to effective use of the voice than innate timbre. I would argue that maybe someone like Mariah Carey, for example, has a more innately interesting timbre to her voice.
There's also a music theory video on that I can link below.
But I would argue that, generally speaking, Sarah takes more interesting and unexpected phrasing risks than someone like Mariah does. I'm not going to say the idea of an innately good voice is a myth, but I do think it's so subjective that it almost doesn't matter when you compare it to things like phrasing, for example.
And that's sort of why I was trying to make the distinction between being a quote-unquote good singer and being a good musician. And I think Sarah is very clearly a good musician. I wouldn't say that she's a bad singer by any means, and she's better than mediocre even. If I were listing the things that I really loved about Sarah McLachlan, I would not list her voice at the top of the list. I would say that her musicianship and the way she uses her voice are above that, if that makes sense. Even though I have listened to this album so many times since 1995, this song always kind of trips me up a little bit because there's so much that it's hard to figure out exactly which version of the melody she's going to sing right now. When all we wanted was to dream, or when all we wanted was to dream. She does both. And then there's like every generation yields and generation yields. And she mixes and matches those throughout the song. It's like, why did you choose this one at this point? And it makes it actually surprisingly hard to sing along with.
Yeah, I think that's an example of one of those subtle things your ear might not pick out the first time you listen to the song. Upon repeated listenings, I've changed my mind on this one. I didn't like it as much at first, but I have always found the refrain one of the catchier ones on the album.
Yeah.
But what I do like about this is that it sort of serves as a cool down after the intensity of possession. It's not uncommon in rock and pop music to start the album with a banger opener and then the second track is a little more subdued to make way for more later.
You had pointed out that you really liked the guitars and the texture, and I agree with that. The way that different guitars layer on top of each other and fade in and out, I think it's really effective in this song. I had talked about the drums in this whole album. This one is all live drums, I believe. But I really like how there's just that simple ride cymbal that's all the way through. And there's so much that can ebb and flow. It's very subtle, but that subtle ebb and flow that is mostly led by the drums and by the layering guitars, I think is one of the things that makes this song, at least texturally, very effective. I wanted to ask you what you meant in your notes when you said political implication for this song.
So I think there could be two ways to interpret the lyrics here. I think the more obvious interpretation, based on the verses especially, is some kind of relationship or love affair that went sour. But in the chorus, she takes such a broad scope, talking about every generation and the newborn hope, and when all we wanted was the dream. To me, the refrain, when it zooms out with such broad terms, such a wide scope, to me, sounds like it could be about something different than just love.
It's interesting that the lyrics are written in such a way that you can read into it with other things that are probably not Sarah's intention, but she would probably like your interpretation. One of my favorite notes on the song is how Sarah uses breath in her performance in this song. At the end of one of the verses, I think it's the second verse, when she says, "Oh, I know will be the death of me," and she's using her breath in that musical way, and I think that's really interesting and something that she doesn't do a ton in this album, but she does change how breathy her voice is at different spots, using more of a supported tone and less of a supported tone. Here she's actually using exhalation and inhalation sounds as part of the music, which I think is really cool.
I didn't care for this one at first because those same textural tropes were already starting to wear a little thin on my ear, but upon re-listening, I like it more than I originally did. I like her use of dissonance in this song, in the harmony especially. I like, as you talked about in your notes, the augmentation that happens metrically speaking, with the meter and the sudden slowdown. I would still have liked a little more of a textural shift at this point, but this is still, for me, one of the highlights of the album.
This is one of my top 2 or 3, for sure. When you're listening to popular music, and I mean large P category pop, which includes rock. This idea actually comes from rock, but has been absorbed by the rest of pop. The key thing about rock music drumming is that the snare drum happens on 2 and 4 in a 4/4 beat. If the tempo is this, then the snare would be ta, ta. And so listening to that clues you into where the bar lines in the rhythm are. The sort of magical thing in this song is that this rhythm that's happening in the verses with ta, ta. In the first chorus, it goes ta, ta. So the beat doesn't change, but the feeling of the meter doubles. Instead of thinking 1, 2, 3, 4, we think 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And so I love that stretch that happens there, and you know it's doubly intentional because the second chorus, it doesn't do that. It only does it in the play out of the second chorus, in the leading back into the verses. I think that's really cool. This is the song that I think has the most interesting texture in the album. I will be giving a full review of the texture of this song in that texture music theory video that's coming, so I'll sort of leave it here. But keep an eye out for that if you're interested in that sort of thing. The last thing that I want to say about this song is that I like the contrast in the tones of Sarah's voice when she's singing low and high. The verses sit pretty low in this song. I looked into your eyes, they told me plenty.
Yeah.
But then, and more than... The verse is sitting low here, but then the pre-chorus, the more... You've got leaps coming into it. It comes down to a lower spot for the choruses themselves, so I think that's really fun.
Another thing I noticed about this song that's interesting is that the harmony almost sort of swings between major and minor. Mm-hmm. That sounds minor. And then suddenly sounds more major.
Yeah.
And that's like even within one just section of the song.
Right. This is one of both of our least favorites. But I think this is one of the ones from this album that Sarah still plays more regularly because it sounds more like her sappier, later music. I don't think it's a bad song. I just think it's not as strong as so much of the rest of this album.
I kind of do think this is a bad song. Maybe a nicer way of putting it is, this is not a song that I will likely be listening to again in the future. This is, to me, too dreary, too twee, too sleepy. I actually am disappointed because I find these lyrics actually some of my favorite on the album. One thing I like about Sarah in comparison to some of her contemporaries who people might group her with, for example, Tori, is that lyrically speaking, Sarah is clearer than people like Tori Amos were without being obvious or heavy-handed with her lyrics, which is a really difficult line to toe. I would argue that I enjoy listening to Tori albums in general more than this one, but I find the message of most of these songs to be more relatable than many Tori songs are. The melody of this song, the repetitiveness, it's funny, I'm arguing that I want better texture variety, but this texture is too sparse for me.
I think part of the reason that I can appreciate it more is because I am more of a listen to the full album person. And so even though this is a song that I don't like as much, I rarely skip anything on this album because it's one of my favorites. But this is one of the songs that it's really fun to sing the harmonies along with her. Hey, are you enjoying this video? Let us know by giving it a like. Subscribe if you're interested in hearing us talk about music, video games, and other media that we love. If you're only interested in watching the music reviews, check out the playlist called Music Talk. That's all the music reviews. Let us know what you think of this album or any of the points that we've made about it in the comments below, and let's get back to the video.
Another one of my favorites on the album. Something about the chord progression feels hymnal. I also enjoyed this texture even more than some of the others. Maybe what it was is that after the sparseness of Good Enough, returning to that creepy synth texture was a nice increase of pace again. I do find the lyrics a little indecipherable here, but I still really enjoy this overall texture, melody, and I really enjoy her performance here too. She continues with these sort of subtle phrasing choices that really reward repeated listenings.
The cover songs don't do very well on the channel for the most part, with one very big exception. But I think that since we are people who can perform, like I was never a professional performer in any way, but we are people who can create actual music for people to listen to, doing a cover is one way to sort of get inside the songwriter's mind a little bit, and they can help you sort of break open and find something in the bones of the song that may not be intentional and or may not be on the surface. And so I think these covers that we've been doing on the channel help us get a better feel for the music. That's part of why I really enjoy doing them, even though they don't do that well in the views, but that's okay. We're gonna do a quick lighting change. Ooh, we're late. This is one of the ones that I believe is entirely a drum machine with no live drums. I'm not positive about that, but it sounds like just a drum machine to me. It's sort of an interesting difference in the rest of the song.
Elsa, let it go. That's all I can do without copyright infringement. Sorry, Disney.
So Elsewhere, I think, is a little bit of a forgettable song, but there's something kind of soothing about it still. Even though this is an album that I've listened to so many times. If you just say, sing Elsewhere by Sarah McLachlan, it would take me a while to figure it out. My point is that I find it kind of soothing still. And I think that the music sits in actually kind of a small box range-wise. After and before songs that are more emotionally charged, I think that's actually kind of nice. Normally I would think of that as sort of a negative. In this case, I actually kind of like it.
I like this one better than good enough, but not much. I might not necessarily skip it when I'm listening to the whole album the way I probably will for good enough. But at this point, this texture to me is too homogenous. I think we are in, what number is this? Is it 6? Yeah, this is track 6, which is the halfway point of the album. I would have liked something more energetic by now, which we'll get to with the next song. There are some cool things going on. I do like the refrain, but this is veering too much for me toward mom rock Sarah and too far away from edgy Sarah.
It is holding the song back from being what it could be. I also think that these are some of the weakest lyrics on the album. They are some of the most specific, and I sort of want a little bit more mystery. I want her to build a little bit more of a mystery.
My review process, for once I was the first person to put notes. Usually there's this like unspoken, not tug of war, but like back and forth between our notes in our spreadsheet. And I was the first one to review this album. And I was harsher in my first review than my edits were, because as I've said more than once, re-listening to this album is a good idea. One cheeky thing I wrote about this song that I didn't delete, even though I thought about deleting it because it is a little harsh, I wrote, finally a song above 90 beats per minute. And I'm not being literal, I'm sure. Like, Possession probably is above 90 beats per minute. I'm sure that other songs are. This was what I would have liked maybe 2 tracks earlier on the album. This is like a kind of a burner of a track. This is also, to me, one of the spots in the album where she sounds vocally the best.
Yes.
I really love the way not only is she can ride her chest voice up in almost like a growly sound at parts, but I like when she kind of clumsily flips into head voice with that almost yodely quality sometimes, like where you belong and in misery, like that. To me, that this song is an indicator of why I would say she is one of the great singers of the 90s, because not everyone can navigate that kind of vocal pathway so effortlessly. Apparently, one cannot say the word effortlessly. Leslie
and her effort.
Exactly. We don't always spend enough time talking about everyone's performances on these solo records, but really the whole band is getting into it. The guitarist sounds really rich and vibrant here.
Yeah, this is one of Sarah's sexiest performances on the album for sure. I want to talk about the bridge on this song, which is just in the guitar solo. It kind of comes out of nowhere, but I really like that. We've got this like dark, twisty, loopy thing happening, and then suddenly we've got this bright guitar major key bridge, and then we come back to the darker, sexier part. I would have never thought of that, and I think it works really well.
I wish that this album had maybe one or two more songs like Circle. To me, there's like a spectrum on this album from this song's energy to like a good enough, with songs like Possession is maybe closer to this song. Songs like Wait and Plenty are kind of more in the middle. I prefer middle and toward this.
I don't necessarily agree that there should be more like this. I think there should be less like the others. I think this album would be okay if it were a track or two shorter. Ice is spooky and sexy and wispy and ghost-like. I really like it. Normally I can sympathize with people when they say they hate the sound of a soprano saxophone. I will always defend a soprano saxophone and say they can be really good because of songs like Ice by Sarah McLachlan. That soprano sax solo. I think it's
and little
suspensions
so between it and
yeah, really good. Though it sounds sexy, it's also just really dark because it's all about getting something you need from something that is bad. So like getting the physical intimacy that you crave from a really bad situation otherwise.
I love this song. I actually wrote this, it probably is my favorite on the album. After my second or third listens, I think it's a toss-up between this and maybe a few others, but I do like the textural variety that this song also brings to the album. It's the most orchestral song, for sure, on the album, and I think it's a good example of how she could have achieved more textural variety without necessarily sacrificing the dark, quiet edge. Textural variety doesn't have to suddenly mean a bubbly synth pop song.
I also like that there's a lot of harmonic experimentation happening here.
Yeah.
In that bridge with the soprano sax. Through most of it, it's following what you would expect. But then suddenly there's these weird cluster chords that come at the end of the bridge with saxophones. It's kind of unpleasant at first, but then the way it resolves is like, oh, that was so cool. This is one of the songs that, as I'm listening, I like it, but then when I think about it afterward, I'm like, it's not that good of a song. But then listening again, it's like, oh, okay.
It's too sleepy for me. I do like that continued use of the sort of cradled swinging between major and minor tonality, which is cool. And I do like her soulful performance here. There are quite a few blues notes in this song.
At least when you get to the choruses, you've got the really fast strumming on that taka-taka-taka-taka-taka. Now you're sleeping peaceful. It's got like a fire underneath it still.
There's a point where mom rock becomes like campfire sing-along more than crying in the shower. And I think this song is one example. You know, I think of other songs too, like Hold On for One More Day by Wilson Phillips is that kind of like, yes, this is cheesy, but we all kind of love it anyway. Like End of the Wedding Party song. I wouldn't necessarily play this at a wedding party, but maybe I might. You know, there's like a kind of sweet, sentimental quality to it. I do like that it is, I think, the only song on the album that is in triple meter.
Right.
It sort of feels like a hug. It's not the kind of song that everyone loves because it's like, ooh, she's so cool. It's more like the friend who walks in the room and you're like, oh, it's you. You know what I mean?
You make good cupcakes.
I don't mind sprinkles on my cupcakes sometimes. And again, this texture is also a little different. There are other acoustic songs in this song's vein, but I would say that it stands apart from those.
I don't hate this song, but it's one of my least favorites on the album. It's just too simple, and she set out to write a simple song. She called it glib, and it's intentionally kind of childish, but it feels like too much out of left field for me. I might like it in a different context, maybe, but even then, still probably not.
What if you put this song earlier on the album? Like maybe third or fourth?
I think Between Ice and Fear is the worst place for it because it's like the wildest tonal swings.
Yeah.
I don't know if putting it earlier would make me like it more. I don't know. Maybe if this were before Fear by a track or two.
What if it were like between Elsewhere and Circle, so that then Circle like sort of comes in with an even bigger punch?
That would be interesting, actually. If you're listening, test that and tell us what you think. This song is intentionally unsettling in the best way. I love the haunting, quiet voices that are panned hard left and right that you hear throughout the song. When the synth and drums come in, it is such a big wah that happens that I think is really, really effective. And then you've got that really gnarly sounding solo. It's probably a synth. It could be a guitar. It's really hard to tell, and I think that's partially intentional. The song is about the breathless fear of wanting to let go, but being unable to, and wondering if you'll be good enough when you do finally let go. Everything about the song sort of supports that in my mind. It's unsettling. It sort of has you on the edge of your seat. It's a little uncomfortable at some points with some of the tones that are happening. And I think that's all intentional.
I really love the texture of this song, her use of dissonance and the harmonies again, the way she mixes those elements and more together to create what might be the darkest song on the album, actually. The one thing that holds the song back for me is I do wish they had put it like a step or two down, just because that... I still don't enjoy the timbre there in her voice. I understand that it's a nice way of painting the idea of the strain of this moment, but I struggled on repeated listenings to understand the lyrics in this song, and not just in that spot. You know, it's a high B, to be clear. Yes, it's definitely higher than many of her contemporaries would sing on a recording, but I wanted to better understand the story here, and I just couldn't, not just at that moment, but the tessitura in general. There are too many words lost for me to really be able to connect to the song in the way that I connect to some of the other songs on the album.
The last track on the album.
Although this isn't one of my favorites, I do like it as a kind of informal closer on the album. It's true that there's one more track after this, but since on the version we're reviewing, it's a cover, the cover sort of feels like the postlude, and this kind of feels like the real end of the album, especially because it shares the name of the album. And I like it as a bookend. I like how the lyrics are empowering and kind of anthemic, even if sometimes they're a little too on the nose.
I think the worst thing is that the first line of this song, after the song called Fear, the first line is, "All the fear has left me now." It's like, no, don't put these two next to each other. It's fine to start the song with "All the fear has left me now," but it feels so corny right after Fear. I like how there's this sort of stumbling feeling to this song, especially in the drums, but also so many of the vocal phrases are short and they stop. Peace in the struggle to find peace. It's so very like Zen in the lyrics and in the way that she's performing it. This is also one of the songs that she gives a really bluesy performance, especially in the play out, in the repeated chorus that keeps happening when she's riffing on top of it. It's a really good performance on this song.
Yeah, I wrote that she chooses her she chooses her vocal moments really well here.
In the version of the album that I have, that is actually the last track. The repeat of Possession is a hidden track that comes after like a minute of silence. In many versions of the album, her cover of Joni Mitchell's Blue is its own track afterward. Blue is the title track off of Joni Mitchell's, I believe, 1974 album. What I like about having this track on this album is that it's really clear that Sarah listened to a lot of Joni. You can find a lot of similarities, especially how they use leaps in their melodic writing and how their lyrics are, like we've talked about with many other songs, very personal, but with enough detachment that it's really easy to insert yourself into that very personal story.
Yeah, this has always been one of my favorite Joni Mitchell songs, and she performs it well, and I like that this cover is different enough to be worth listening to over the original, instead of the original.
Yeah, this is one of the songs that Sarah uses like the big wall of sound vocals, and that's one thing that really distinguishes it from Joni's version, because Joni's is so intimate and it's just piano and voice, and this is more of a wash of sound that's happening from other voices and other instruments that I think certainly not better than Joni's version, but it's very interesting and worth listening to, like you were saying. Critical reception from professional critics at the time. If you look at what's posted on Wikipedia and average everything out, from the calculations that I made, it looks like critics at the time gave it 87%. Now, this is one of my favorite albums of all time, as I was saying. I myself gave it a 94 because of all of the albums that we've reviewed, this is my second favorite that we've reviewed so far. Only Hounds of Love I like more than this so far. So looking at what the critics giving it an 87, when you're on the road and everyone who's driving faster than you is a maniac and everyone who's driving slower than you is a grandpa, You know, it's like only what I say is right. I'm intentionally trying to step back from that, and I know that I have a lot of baggage of nostalgia from this album, but 94 is what I personally feel about it.
Yeah, my original score was lower, but I've bumped it up to an 85.
Now, our combined score with all the scores that we gave all of the individual songs comes out to 87, which is the same as what the critics say. This is the score for this album showing on the screen now in context with all the other things that we reviewed around it. As I said, I wish this were a little higher, but that's okay.
Like I've said more than once now, if you are new to Sarah McLachlan or haven't listened to the album before, I would recommend listening more than once to give yourself a chance to notice some of her subtler choices.
Who is this album for? Or if someone likes X, they would also like this album. People who already like Sarah McLachlan will probably like this. If you only like Surfacing and Later, you'll probably still like this, but this does have more of an edge to it than all of those.
I have a hot take. I think people who like Evanescence might like this album. Hear me out. I know most people think that Evanescence is more capital R rock than Sarah McLachlan, but if you split apart the elements, the underlining elements of the music, as opposed to, you know, what you might notice at first listen, I think there are some similarities here. I think if you break those elements down and separate them from just instrumentation, you will find there are more similarities than you might realize. For example, I think Sarah McLachlan's voice and Amy Lee's voice and how they use them and phrase are closer than you might first think. It's true that Amy tends to sit in that beltier range more than Sarah does, but they take many similar tacks in songs.
Yeah, Amy sings with a more supported tone throughout and is singing louder most of the time.
Yeah, but you know, both Evanescence and Sarah McLachlan, there's this kind of twisted edge in a lot of the music. And I think if you were to just add more electric guitars to this album, it might sound like an Evanescence album.
That's interesting. I'd have to think about that. I don't disagree with you, but I'd have to think about that more to see if I fully buy into that. Actually, I think an interesting doorway into Sarah McLachlan might be Joni Mitchell. Joni is obviously folkier, but it's clear that Sarah has a lot of reference for Joni Mitchell. And I think a Joni lover would appreciate that in this album.
There's an argument to be made also for Tori Amos and, you know, others of her contemporaries.
Especially if your favorite Tori album is Little Earthquakes. Yeah. I think this would be a very short trip down the street to get to Sarah McLachlan, this album. Thanks for watching this video. Down here is a video that YouTube thinks you might like, so check that out. Up here is wait, I did that backwards. Up here is another video that YouTube thinks you might like. Down here is the Music Talk playlist of other music reviews. Please subscribe if you want to hear us chat more about stuff like this. Let us know what other things you would like us to cover. We're very near the end of our 1993 coverage, finally. And I think that's about it. Maintain your groovy selves.